Well, a good morning to everyone that has just joined us, and hello if you are watching the replay of this webinar. Welcome to what is the last of our webinars for 2021. This time all about buildings and wildlife. What are your responsibilities? I am your host, Andy Ferguson, and joining me today, I'm pleased to welcome Julie Riley from Wildscapes. We are about to start the main presentation. Just for those that are just joining us, if you do want to pose any questions over the course of the webinar, if I can firstly point you to the chat facility that runs down the left or the right-hand side. If you're on a desktop, if you're on a mobile, it will just be at the bottom. You just need to pull up. If you want to go on there, say hello, tell us where you are in the country or in the world. We'd love to hear from you. You can also alternatively as well pose any questions to myself directly via email. All you need to do is just email me at andy@property-care.org. That's andy@property-care.org. Or alternatively, feel free to use any of our social channels. If you're watching the recording of this and you do have a question, you can email me as well. Just the email address I mentioned, andy@property-care.org. And I will endeavour to do my best to answer that question for you and get back to you. Well, I can see that we are pretty much bang on almost 9 o'clock. So buildings and wildlife. Julie, how do we stop ourselves from getting into trouble with the law when we see conflicts with wildlife? How do we even find out what potential conflicts we might even come across? And what considerations do the many individuals listening to this, construction professionals, developers, landscapers, invasive weed specialists, what do we need to take into account when we come across these obstacles? Now, I know this is a minefield of information, but I am hoping you will give us a lot of clarity over the next 45 minutes, Julie. So over to yourself.
Oh, thank you very much for that introduction. And yes, it is a complex topic with quite a lot of legislation to have a quick look at. So this will be a bit of a scratching the surface overview. But I'll start off just by introducing myself properly. I'm Julie Riley. I'm a senior ecologist working for a consultancy called Wildscapes, which is part of the Wildlife Trust Consultancy Network. A little bit about me. I am a botanical specialist primarily, so I do a lot of habitat surveys. I do reports for developers, but also for people who are interested in managing their wild space more effectively. So I do a lot of things like preliminary ecological appraisals, ecological impact assessments, and more recently I've started on biodiversity net gain reporting. So my experience is basically about going to a property. It could be as little as a house and a garden, or it could be a big empty field where 50, 100 houses are going to go in, and having a look at the ecological factors that are present, and then advising people on the potential constraints and the potential opportunities for working with the wildlife that is there. Wildscapes, we're based in Sheffield, and we do all sorts of different things. So ecology surveys that are required for planning, protected species surveys, so that's things like bat surveys, newt surveys, mitigation and licensing, management plans, overseeing practical works on the ground. We also have a land management team that does a lot of the practical work, so lots of work on the moorland at this time of year. They're all using helicopters to plant to deliver tree stakes at the moment, to plant trees on the moors. Woodland management, a lot of pond creation, and lots of outdoor infrastructure and invasive weed removal. And then we also do some training and development services as well. I am supposed to say, though, that other ecologists are available. Wildscapes is just one consultancy. There are many across the country and you may already be working with ecological consultants for your requirements. So what we're going to talk about today is buildings and wildlife, and that's a very broad title. I'm going to primarily focus on an overview of UK wildlife legislation, and particularly look at legislation that has a direct impact on the work that you may be doing. And I've been told that you range from architects, builders, developers, housing associations, construction, etc. So it's people who have something to do with developing and managing properties. So I'm going to try and look at it from the perspective of a consultant ecologist that works with developers and householders in particular. And we'll look at what species and habitats are protected, but in very general terms. And you'll see why as I start to go through the legislation. And I'll try and make it relevant to you and look at how to take it into consideration and where you can actually turn to for help and assistance when you are working somewhere where you think there is a wildlife issue to take into account. So first of all, biodiversity is protected by law, and by biodiversity I mean everything from entire ecosystems, you know, of an entire country or entire landscape, down to individual named species like particular species of bat. And they are all protected by law in varying degrees. So there are laws existing that protect specific areas. So for example, the Humber Estuary is subject to lots of different protections. Specific habitats, so things like ancient woodland, and specific species, so things like water vole or great crested newt. And the laws are there to protect species from hunting and from harm, and to also protect habitats and species from the impact of human activities, things like mining or building. So whatever activity you are doing, whether it's planning a development of 1,000 houses or doing work on an individual householder's roof or garden, you have to really be aware that there is legislation, have a broad understanding of what the legislation is, and assess the risks that your work may pose to wildlife. So legislation protecting biodiversity comes from three main sources. So we sign up, as the UK, we sign up to about 35 international conventions and directives that we then put into UK law in different ways. They go into our national legislation, and we also have some national legislation that has been developed within the UK. And then there is also planning legislation, which isn't specifically about wildlife, but has a lot of stuff in it that relates to protecting wildlife and biodiversity. So if I start off with the international conventions, and these really started in 1971, we had the Ramsar Convention, and what that led to was protecting specific wildlife sites internationally that are important for wild birds. And in the UK, this tends to be coastal areas, estuary areas that are incredibly important for wild wading birds. In 1979, we had two conventions, the Bonn Convention and the Bern Convention. The Bonn Convention protects migratory species and their habitats. So that's things like birds, but also things like sea creatures like dolphins that move around. It was recognized that there's no point in having protection in one country if a species migrates to a totally different area of the world for half of its year. And a lot of migratory species that people are aware of are bird species. So we get things like cuckoos that migrate between the UK and Africa, and they are protected under the Bonn Convention. And then the Bern Convention looked at protecting wild plant and animal species and the habitats that support them. Then we had a bit of a gap until 1992 when we had what's called the Rio Convention, which was looking at developing national strategies to protect biodiversity across the world. And in the UK, this led to the UK National Biodiversity Action Plan, or often known as BAP or UK BAP, which has since been superseded by other legislation. But it was the first time that we really identified BAP species and BAP habitats that were of conservation concern. So particular habitats and species that you need to take account of when you are working on property or land. In Ireland, this actually led to something called the Ireland National Biodiversity Action Plan. So same idea, but just slightly different legislation. So how does that apply in practice? You end up with a list of priority habitats and priority species that are derived from the Rio Convention, known as the UK BAP habitats and species. The list has been amended several times, and when devolution started in 1997, the lists have diverged. So the list in Scotland will be slightly different from the list in England, etc. And you can actually go onto a website, the JNCC website, which can link you to an enormous spreadsheet of all of the species and habitats, and give you information about their protection and where they are priority species. So just as an example, in England there are 56 priority habitats, and that includes things like hedgerows, ponds, deciduous woodland, certain types of grassland like meadows and acid grassland and such things like that. And there's 943 priority species of plants and animals, and a lot of them are ones you'll have never heard of and probably wouldn't recognize if you met them. There's a lot of invertebrate species, so little types of bugs and bees. There's lots of fungi, lichens, mosses, that kind of thing that most people would just not even notice. But there are ones that you will have heard of, things like bat, great crested newt, water vole, hedgehog, that kind of thing, that most people that work with property have got a vague awareness that they are protected in some way. And this is one of the ways in which they are listed. So although the legislation has moved on from when this priority habitat and species list was developed, it's still used quite a lot. It's still referred to in all countries of the UK, but you need to be aware that some priority habitats or species have legal protection and some don't. So trying to work out which ones are protected and which aren't is quite complex. And derived from the UK BAP, there are lots of local BAPs that are still in local planning or local development plans, and in nature partnerships. So if you work in a local authority that has a local biodiversity action plan, where they say that they prioritize a certain type of grassland or a certain type of woodland, or they are particularly interested in protecting a reed bunting or a habitat or something like that, then you'll need to be aware of that, so that you're not inadvertently going to do work on an area that supports those species and potentially harm those species. So that's international. Then we go a little bit down into European community directives. So some of these directives have actually implemented the international conventions. So 1979 Birds Directive implements the Berne Convention, and that gives general protection of all wild birds and protection of specific sites that are important for birds. And in the UK, it's implemented by the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. And in Ireland, it's implemented by the Wildlife Act 1976 that was amended. And I'll go through what some of the specific protections are for birds in a moment, because I think that's quite important for people working on properties. We also, in 1985 and then revised in 97, have the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, and that requires assessment of the impacts of public and private developments on the environment and biodiversity prior to planning permission being given. It's implemented differently in different countries of the UK, but the general principle is present in all countries. And then in 92, we had a very important one, the Habitats Directive, which requires protection of sites and species of European importance. And there are long lists of very specific species that have European protection. This was transposed into law by the Conservation Natural Habitats Regulations 94, but since devolution in 97, it's actually diverged depending on which country you're in. So in England and Wales, it's the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2010. In Scotland, the original regulations are still in force but have been amended. In Northern Ireland, it's the Conservation, Natural Habitats, etc. Regulations 1995. And in the Republic of Ireland, it's now the European Communities, Birds and Natural Habitats Regulations 2011. I did tell you it was complicated. So devolution means you need to check which legislation applies in the area that you're working in. And if you work across countries, so if you live on the border, say, between England and Wales and work in both countries, you need to be aware that the legislation could be different depending on where you are actually working. So what actually leads to this European legislation, which is all still in force, Brexit hasn't changed that yet, is that we have a number of sites that are what we call statutory designated sites at a European scale. So what you get are special protection areas and special areas of conservation. And the special protection areas are designed to protect birds, and there are 82 special protection areas in England. And the special areas of conservation are designed to protect habitats and species. And there are 78 habitats types in the UK and 43 protected species in the UK. So when the EC Habitats Directive was transposed into UK law, what it meant was that you have a duty to, or the country has a duty to promote the maintenance of biodiversity by taking measures to maintain or restore natural habitats and wild species. And then there are these appendices, what are called annexes, that list the plant and animal species and the habitat that supports those species out in full. And it lists several hundred species of plants and animals, but it doesn't include any fungi, lichens or birds, because birds have their own protection under the Birds Directive. So you may hear people talking about European protected species, and that's where this comes from. So there's the list for Britain isn't that massive, but it's big enough. So you have certain species that you commit offences if you harm them. And for European protected species, it is an offence to deliberately capture, disturb, injure or kill a listed wild animal. In Scotland, it's an offence to deliberately harass a wild animal. Everywhere else, it's an offence to deliberately take or destroy the eggs of a wild animal, to damage or destroy a breeding site or resting place, to intentionally or recklessly disturb a protected species while it is occupying a structure or place which it uses for shelter or protection, or to obstruct access to any structure or place the species uses for shelter or protection, to be in possession of or control a wild animal, or to sell or offer for sale a wild animal. So that is a massive paragraph of offences. The key things that I think are relevant to you are if you know that there are bats in a structure you are working on, or think that there are likely to be bats in a structure that you are working on. If you go ahead and do that work without having due regard to checking for bats, for example, then you are committing an offence. And the fines used to be capped for bats. It used to be £5,000 per bat, but that's recently, the cap's been lifted, and I'll show you some examples of fines that have been handed out for what's essentially wildlife crime. So it's a key thing to think about. Are there likely to be any European protected species present on a site that you are doing work at? And if there are, what can you do to avoid that harm? And that usually involves calling on an ecologist for assistance. If an ecologist finds that there are European protected species present, then there is a system of derogation, which basically means you can apply to either Natural England, Nature Scot, Natural Resources Wales, DAERA in Northern Ireland, or the National Parks and Wildlife Services in Ireland, and you apply for a licence to do the works that risks damaging and destroying the breeding site or resting place. And it's a whole process that does cost time and money, but less money than if you don't go through that process and end up getting fined for breaching the legislation. So how on earth do you know if you're working on a designated site or that there's a priority habitat present? Well, this is a free resource that everybody can access. It's called Magic. It's run by DEFRA, and the web address is there, magic.defra.gov.uk, and it has a whole list of menus down the left-hand side, and you can choose what you want the map to show. So you can zoom into your location, and then you can set it to show as much or as little as you want. And I've just done a map of the edge of the Peak District near to where I live, just showing some of the nationally designated sites, internationally designated protection areas. I think it might have the odd, it's got a triple SI on there, which has specific protection. And also it's got some of the protected, priority habitats, areas of ancient woodland, and even a little bit of information about granted European protected species licenses, which it tends to have for things like bats, great crested newts, amphibians, great crested newts, reptiles, that sort of thing, which can help you to work out whether or not you're likely to have a bat population in the area. And it's an incredibly useful resource, and I recommend that if you're starting work somewhere and you want to have a quick get a quick feel for whether there's anything you need to take into consideration, having a look at the Magic map and playing with the settings on the menu will really help you to see what is there. And it does help you by explaining what each thing is as well. It has a little information button and links you to other places so that you can actually work out what you are looking at. Okay, so moving on to national legislation. Most organised conservation in the UK has actually only really occurred within the last 150 years. So I don't know how many of you are, for example, members of the RSPB, but that was founded in 1889 by a lady called Emily Williamson to fight the fashion for feathers. So fashion at the time had a lot of feathers built into clothing and hats. And the feathers were, a collection of feathers was driving certain species of bird like egrets into extinction or towards extinction. So they started to lobby against it, and the RSPB was formed and are still a very big player in protecting birds and habitats now. Between the wars, there was actually quite a lot of lobbying for wildlife and access to the countryside. So, for example, there was the Ramblers mass trespass on Kinder Scout, which actually eventually led to the creation in 1949 of the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act. This creates and protects the national parks in the UK. Scotland and Northern Ireland have slightly different acts, but they do the same thing. But then one of the major pieces of legislation came into force in 1981, and that is the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which has been amended lots of times as different legislation has come in, and but it's one of the core pieces of legislation that protects wildlife in this country. It covers England, Wales and Scotland. In Northern Ireland, the equivalent is the Wildlife Northern Ireland Order 1985. And in the Republic of Ireland, it's the Wildlife Act 1976. But what the Wildlife and Countryside Act does is protect sites of national importance for nature conservation and gives protection to specific species. So you're probably getting the idea that you've got these key species that seem to be protected in different ways. And some of them are protected in multiple pieces of legislation, and some of them are only protected under one piece of legislation. So it is a complicated picture. Another key piece of legislation was the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act 2006. And what this does is place a duty on all public authorities, so we're talking planning departments here, to consider biodiversity. It requires consideration of the Rio Convention, well, that international convention, and requires species and habitats of principal importance for the conservation of biodiversity to be listed and protected. So basically, the UK Biodiversity Action Plan species got subsumed into what are now called species of principal importance. And often in my circle anyway, you might hear them shorthanded as Section 41 species, because that's the section in the NERC Act where they are listed out. So again, in the devolved parts of the UK, there are slightly different acts that enact this, but the principle is the same, that there is a list of species and habitats that are of principal importance. There's also a few other bits and pieces of legislation. So in 1997, the Hedgerow Regulations were issued, which some people know about, farmers know about for sure, but perhaps you may not be aware that if you need to remove a hedgerow, it has to, if it's over 30 years old, it has to be checked against the Hedgerow Regulations to see whether it is what's classed as an important hedgerow. And there's a whole formula for identifying whether the hedgerow is important. And you may need planning permission to actually remove that hedgerow. In Ireland, for example, there's a very specific flora protection order that identifies specific species that need protecting. And then in 2015, we had the Infrastructure Act, which allows species control orders to be issued by a relevant authority. And that's to protect against non-native invasive species. And again, slightly different in other places. In Scotland, it's the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act 2011. So just going into the Wildlife and Countryside Act a little more deeply. Like I said, it's one of the main pieces of legislation. It is the mechanism for creating sites of special scientific interest in England and Wales. So if you are thinking that you might be next to SSSI, you can check on that magic website and it'll tell you whether there's a SSSI near you, or if your property is located in the risk zone. So you not only have the SSSI, but you also have a buffer zone around the SSSI, which is designated as a risk zone, and certain activities like water extraction or livestock farming or burning can be prohibited within those buffer zones, and you may have to consult with Natural England, for example. But the Wildlife and Countryside Act gives protection to native species, including the protection of all wild birds, their eggs and their nests. And I think most people are probably aware that all nests and eggs are protected while they are breeding. And that is from the moment that a bird brings the first twig to make a nest, that is a protected nest and cannot be disturbed, removed or interfered with in any way until the eggs have hatched out and the fledglings have left the nest. There are certain species of bird that have additional protection, which are sometimes known as Schedule 1 birds, where it's not only their nest that's protected, but they are protected from disturbance while the chicks are fledging, and you end up with 20-meter exclusion zones around a nest if you find one, that sort of thing. And it can and does stop work on work sites to let that protected bird finish its breeding cycle. And some nests where birds return to the same nest over and over again every year, like ospreys, they have permanent protection. So you can't wait for the osprey to finish breeding and fly off and then chop down the tree that they've built their nest in. That nest is protected. The Wildlife and Countryside Act also protects certain named wild animals and plants. And it's also where you have the Schedule 9 species listed. So those are things like Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, various non-native animals, where you are prohibited from keeping certain animals and plants or from causing them to spread in the wild. And licenses can be granted to avoid committing an offence. And then the NERC Act is the one where Section 40 gives public authorities the duty to conserve and enhance biodiversity, and Section 41 is where the Secretary of State is compelled to produce this list of species of principal importance and habitats of principal importance. So in practice, what you end up with is a sort of, this is just a snapshot. I've just picked out a few species that people will have heard of, where you can see that bats have actually got protection across all sorts of different bits of legislation. They're a European protected species, they're protected in the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and they're also a Section 41 species in England and the equivalent in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. Whereas you have other species like the wildcat, which is a European protected species, a Wildlife and Countryside protected species, but it's only on Scotland's priority species list, and that makes sense because that's where it lives. And then you have ones that might surprise you. So, for example, hedgehog. It's not a European protected species. It only has partial protection in the Wildlife and Countryside Act, but it is listed as a species of principal importance, so it's a priority species. And it can get quite complicated when you get to things like reptiles. So European protected species are limited to 2, sand lizard and smooth snake. But the Wildlife and Countryside Act protects all 6 of our native species. And then the priority species lists depends on where you live. And that's to do with, are those species actually present in those locations? There are no birds on the European protected species list at all, because they're all protected anyway from different derived legislation. So all birds are protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And there are numerous different species in different parts of the country that are listed specifically as being species of principal importance. And then there's lots of things you might not even think about. Invertebrates, fish even. So sturgeon is a European protected species. I have to say I've never met a sturgeon, so I have no idea what one looks like, but I'll leave it alone if I find one. There's only 9 plants protected in the UK under the European protected species list, but numerous plants protected through other mechanisms. So basically, you're probably now thinking, oh my goodness, how on earth will I know? And this is where ecological consultants can help you. So the penalties for not getting it right can be quite significant. So you need to think about, when you're working on a property, what could be here? What could cost me money if I don't get it right? Because species are protected across these multiple pieces of legislation. So you might have, for example, an old barn that somebody wants to convert with a pond in the garden, and there's a hedgerow behind it. So I would think, okay, so what's living in the barn now? Is it a place where bats could find suitable habitat? Are there little gaps that bats could squeeze into? Are there barn owl droppings around? Maybe there's a barn owl roosting or nesting in it. What's growing in the pond? In fact, does the pond have any great crested newts in it? How old is the hedgerow, and how special is the hedgerow? Would it be classed as an important hedgerow? Are there any birds nesting in the hedgerow? So if it needs to be taken out in the middle of the year, during the bird breeding season, what would have to be done to avoid committing an offence? And it's logical. It's just basically logic, thinking through what you can and can't do, and what you might affect by what you want to do. And the fines for breaching the law can add up really quickly. So I said that the £5,000 per bat cap has recently been removed, and you can see fairly recently a developer was fined £600,000 for destroying a bat roost. But you also have people who do things like remove hedgerows without thinking about the fact that birds will be nesting in them. You have people felling trees that have active bird of prey nests in them. You even get fined for, like this article here, a forest of Japanese knotweed fined £18,000 for allowing it to spread into the wild. So plenty of things that can go wrong. The example I always think of from my own experience, one of my colleagues went out and did a bat survey at a property owned by a householder who had recognised the potential for bats in their roof and got Wildscapes out to have a look. And the bat survey found one bat leaving. So yes, it was definitely a bat roost, a small bat roost, but a bat roost nonetheless, which was protected by law. I think my colleague arranged to go back to do the second survey, and then got a phone call from the homeowner saying it was all right, but it didn't need to come back because they'd stripped the roof anyway. And while they were stripping the roof, they'd found a nest of a bird and they'd stuck it in a hedge, so that was fine too. And unfortunately, we had to report that to the police because that was a crime, and I think that did end up going to magistrates' court. I'm not quite sure of the outcome, but I think they got fined. Sometimes it's ignorance, sometimes it's recklessness, and sometimes it's deliberate. But basically, it's very easy to avoid, and it's cheaper to get somebody to help you do it properly than it is to actually take the risk. It's a bit like speeding. People speed and get away with it, but then sometimes they get caught by the speeding camera, don't they? And get the points on their license. So I've got a little bit of time left. So just quickly to talk about other legislation that's not specifically about wildlife, but that does impact on wildlife. So planning law in particular, it's regulated differently in the devolved administrations. So in England, where I'm based, it's the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. But then there's lots of different acts in the different parts of the country. And planning policies include requirements to consider biodiversity. And in England, that's the National Planning Policy Framework. And essentially, it basically gives you obligations if you are working with property or land to consider the impact on biodiversity. And when your planning application is looked at, they will check whether or not you have actually gone through that process. There are also local plans. So in England, they're local plans. In Wales and Scotland, they're local development plans. I think they are local plans in Northern Ireland and regional or local plans in Ireland. So local planning authorities will identify local protections for nature sites and biodiversity. And that's really useful to know that a lot of them have these interactive policy maps. This is Doncaster's, just as an example, because the one thing that the Magic website does not have is locally designated wildlife sites. But your local planning authority will have information on their website about those local sites, where they are and why they are designated. And that's important to take into account as well. There are multiple other planning related laws and regulations that have policies, but I really don't have time to go through every single one. There's just a few animal welfare related bits of legislation that you need to be aware of. You might know that badgers are a protected species, but you haven't seen them in any of the lists that I've given you so far, and that's because they are only protected under the Protection of Badgers Act 1992. And it's about animal welfare more than it is about them being a specifically protected or important species, because they are relatively common in the UK, but they are protected as well as their sets from disturbance and harm. And then there is some legislation that makes it an offence to cause unnecessary suffering to wild animals. And it's just worth being aware of this, because if you are digging out somewhere that's got rabbits present, you need to not inflict unnecessary suffering when you're trying to do the work that you need to do on the land. Just because they're not a protected species doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want in order to get rid of them. Then there's loads of new and future legislation that's coming in. UK policy is incredibly dynamic at the moment. Brexit has happened, but no legislation that's been derived from EU or international legislation has fundamentally changed yet. Some of it has been amended so that it's still in force, but nothing has altered. It's all still the same as it was. But on the 11th of November this year, the Environment Act 2021 received royal assent, and this is the most significant environmental legislation in over 20 years. It gives legally binding targets to halt species decline. It requires developments to achieve a minimum of 10% biodiversity net gain. It requires councils to consult more strongly on street tree felling. It implements plans for local nature recovery strategies, and this is just a pick and mix of some of the things that it covers, because it covers all sorts of other things around water and all sorts of things. There's also potentially a new planning bill, which may alter how things are done. And there's lots of different biodiversity strategies and action plans being looked at across the devolved administrations. So what can you actually do? Because it's very complex. I would say the key thing is to learn a bit about the key species, the ones that you're most likely to encounter. So especially birds, bats and invasive plants. Get a little bit of knowledge so that you can look at a building and think, this looks like bats might sneak up under the slate tiles, or there's some droppings here, maybe that's bats, or maybe it's owls or something like that. Just so that you're aware of what you might be walking into. Have a look at the local planning authority website for the site that you're looking at. They often have guidance on biodiversity anyway, and they'll often have an interactive policy map. Have a look at the Magic website for habitats and designations. And then I can't stress enough, ecologists, this is what we do. Consult an ecologist at the very start of your project. When you're considering buying land, get us to go out and do a baseline survey. Before you're drawing up the plans, get us to tell you whether or not your site for your building is going to interfere with a priority habitat. Before you get a builder, think about have you got bats in your attic? Before you start digging out somebody's pond or putting in some kind of landscaping, you know, what is there already? Before you start stripping the roof, has it been checked for bats? What will you do if you find a bat? And how are you going to pay the fine if you don't think about these things? So I said right at the beginning that I'm a member of Wildscapes is a member of the Wildlife Trust Consultancies. Obviously, I'm based in Sheffield, so our work tends to be Sheffield, Derbyshire, Nottingham area. But we do have consultancies across the country. And if you go to the Wildlife Trust Consultancies website, wtconsultancies.co.uk, you can actually see where all of the other consultancies are based. Obviously, other consultancies are available, but we think we're special because we are linked to our local wildlife trust. So we all operate in a way that means all our profits are donated to our local wildlife trust, so that we can actually help them develop the landscapes and wildlife and habitats across the country. Basically, we give you lots of advice, and in employing wildlife trust consultancies, the profits generated support conservation projects, creating a better environment for people and wildlife. And that is me done, and I think I'm bang on time.
You are bang on time. Well done, you, I have to say. Well, I mean, certainly from my perspective, Julie, I have to say that was fantastic. I mean, I can't help but feel, though, that it blows my mind, both in terms of the complications and also how much legislation there is. That how do folks get their head around about it? I suppose the key question would be, is there not a way of making this simpler so that wider individuals can really stay in the right side of the law?
It's very tricky. Unfortunately, there really doesn't seem to be like a one-stop shop for everything. It's the JNCC website is a good starting point, because the JNCC, which is the Joint Nature I never get this right, Joint Nature Conservation Council, I think, advises the government, and it covers the whole of the UK. So you can actually have a good look on the JNCC if you're interested in the specific detail. I would say always start with your local authorities' biodiversity pages, because they will usually tell you a bit about the local area and what the priority species are, and then often they'll also refer you to the sort of guidance that you need to follow related to planning or activities on your land or property. But no, unfortunately it is complex, and that's why we have this whole ecological consultancy system.
And wonderful people like yourself.
Yes.
Well, folks, we're now just coming into kind of questions. If you do have a question, then feel free to pose it into the chat facility or send it to me via email if you're listening to replay at andy@property-care.org. So first questions, I'm just going to go through the questions that we emailed to me just beforehand, Julie, just before we go into some of the live questions. So the first question came from Charles Green. You've touched partly on this, but if you can go over it a little bit, that would be great. But he's asking, what triggers the requirements for a bat ecological survey during building works?
Okay, so what we would normally do is, I can tell you how it works for when a developer is looking at developing a site. You can't really say that there's definitely no bats somewhere until you have had somebody come out and do what's called a preliminary roost inspection or assessment, and that can be done on either buildings or trees. And what we do is we look at the building and we look for places where bats may be able to access, and have a look inside the building and see whether or not There are places for bats to roost, whether there's any evidence of bats being there, and then we will rate it as either negligible suitability, low, medium, high suitability. So the older the building is, the more likely it is to be constructed in a way that is bat friendly. So stone buildings, slate tiles, or if it's a dilapidated building where the tiles have lifted and shifted, or there's lead flashing that's lifted away, because bats only need the smallest spaces to sort of crawl in. That's particularly the common ones like pipistrelles. There are lots of different species of bats and they have different requirements. But we would go and look at the site and say whether or not we thought surveys were needed, and then there's a specific window which I think someone's just put in the chat, May to October, where surveys can be conducted to see whether the site is being used as a roost, and if we don't get any bats using the site as a roost, we would say you're okay to proceed. If you do get bats using the site as a roost, it would have to get a license from Natural England. But what does happen is that people don't think about this, and then we get emergency call outs where a builder has started stripping a roof and finds a bat, and then basically all work must stop straight away at that point, and an ecologist needs to be called out to come and rescue the bat and then advise on what you do next.
So the bottom line is, it's not easy.
No, it's not.
It's definitely. Well, just out of interest, actually, is there any specific guidance on what is required in a bat survey that would help contractors be fully aware of it beforehand, so when they do come across it, they have an understanding of what might need to get stopped? Is there any kind of pointers you could point people to?
I would look at the Bat Conservation Trust website, because they've got lots of guidance for householders, for developers, and that is probably the best place that you'll get something written in plain English that tells you about bats and what you need.
Perfect. No, perfect. Well, next question comes from Melvin Welsh. This might actually be a little bit controversial, so you might want to restrict it to just your opinion on this one, but he's asking, what are your thoughts on the use of plastic seagull eggs to mitigate against nesting seagulls on buildings and causing public health issues, i.e. the defect, I suppose, making the building look nasty through poos and causing all sorts of nuisance and noise, etc. I mean, what are your thoughts on the use of these plastic eggs?
I haven't actually heard of that as a thing. Obviously, I don't live near the coast, so I don't get a lot of seagull inquiries. But certainly there are some birds that are listed in the Wildlife and Countryside Act that are actually treated as pests, and you can get licenses to deal with birds that are considered pests. Things like pigeons in city centres. So I think you do sometimes see netting put up or spikes put up to try and dissuade birds from setting up home in places where it can cause a public health hazard. But that there is environmental health, there is legislation that allows you to deal with birds if it's a public health issue. But you still have to go through the proper procedures and not just take it on yourself. I think if plastic eggs are there as a deterrent, if they work as a deterrent, that's fine. I mean, football clubs have plastic raptors sort of on the roof of their buildings, don't they, to try and dissuade pigeons and things. So I think that's perfectly reasonable. Somebody has put replacement of eggs is only done under permit in the chat.
Yeah, I can see that by Mervyn. Yes. Well, Mervyn, do you know, I'd be interested to hear your opinion, how successful you find the plastic eggs are, just in the knowledge that it's not something that Julie has used or done. So yeah, please do let us know how you find it, and if you do actually find it a useful tool to deter the seagulls from going to the buildings. But moving on to the next question. Actually, this is a really interesting question. I kind of bumped it up. It comes from Scott Wimpenny. He's asking, if a building owner introduces a green roof, a green wall, or nesting boxes to encourage biodiversity, does this require involvement of an ecologist Act exception? And does maintenance then require licenses by virtue of the habitat?
So what we're getting into here is kind of biodiversity net gain territory, I think. At the moment, we are in a transitional period. So the Environment Act mandates biodiversity net gain, and it mandates a minimum of 10% biodiversity net gain. But we're in a transitional period for 2 years, so it's not actually a legal requirement yet. However, many local authorities have already started adopting it in their local plans. So if you install bird boxes, green roofs, green walls, etc., to increase the biodiversity on that development, which is a great thing and everybody should be doing it, then certainly in 2 years' time, there will be a requirement for a 30-year management plan, which will require those features to achieve a specific condition, particularly the green roof and the green walls, because those are habitats rather than boxes. I would say that when you're planning boxes, try and integrate them. If you're actually building a new building, integrate bat and bird boxes into the fabric of the building rather than putting them on the outside of the building, because they are designed to be low or no maintenance when they're integrated, and it means you don't have to worry about replacing them every 5 years or 10 years or what have you. So, yeah.
Okay.
Does that answer that question?
I think so. I think it was a bit of a loaded question to start off with as well. So where do you actually start on it? But I think you did really well. And hopefully, Scott, that's given you some feedback. Next question comes from a Michael Huff. He's asking, is there a simple process that contractors can follow to assess private properties prior to work starting, i.e. gardens, roof, walls, hedges, etc., etc.?
Well, that is what is called a preliminary ecological appraisal, which is carried out by an ecologist usually. The CIEEM, which is the governing body or one of the governing bodies for ecology, has got a useful PDF on their website, which goes over what is involved in a preliminary ecological appraisal or PEA. And it's usually split into requesting records from the local record centre so that you can see what species have been recorded in the area previously, looking at things like MAGIC to look at designations, looking at the local policies as well as the national legislation and policies, and then carrying out an initial field visit where you look at everything. You map the habitats, you make a species list of what's growing, you identify the priority habitats, you look for evidence of protected species, so you might look for holes or tracks or trails or backdroppings, what have you, and then you produce a report that says, you know, these are our recommendations. You might need additional surveys to check for bats. It might be all good and you can proceed with what you want to do. So that's kind of the bread and butter of what an ecological consultant does.
All righty. Well, just moving on and get just to let everyone know, I don't think I'm going to get through everyone's questions, but what I will do, and I'm not going to guarantee this, but I will pass the questions that may not have been asked on to Julie, and if Julie does get a chance to, she may get back to you, but I'll try and get through as many as I can in the time that we've got. But moving on to the next question. This question comes from Gary Newton. Now, he has been very specific here in saying in respect to roof works and localized areas within the roof, is a bat survey required for repairs, or can localized repairs within the roof be done without license if they're not disturbing the bats?
Yeah, so if the building is assessed as not likely to have bats, then the repair can carry on. If the roof is assessed as holding the potential for bats and the surveys have revealed that there is potentially a bat roost present, then the ecologist will advise on how to proceed. So it may be that you can do it without a license if you stick to specific areas. It may be that you require a license because the disturbance will be too great. It's very difficult to judge it because it's on a case-by-case basis. So the answer is yes, that is possible, but it would need to go through the proper procedure to check that it's legal.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think just to throw in here that I think erring on the side of caution is probably a good thing, and seek out some advice if you are going to be considering that, either through Julie or one of the another ecologist. I think.
Well, the precautionary principle. Yeah, it's called the precautionary principle, and it is written into law. Yeah.
So next question is actually asking for tips. Stephen Johnson's asking, out with the magic tool that you mentioned earlier on, are there any other quick tools contractors can use to quickly look up if there may be conflicts with wildlife and plant species while working on sites?
So the only one I haven't mentioned is the National Biodiversity Atlas, the NBN. And that is somewhere where you can look at species records that have been submitted either by members of the public or by sort of societies like the British Trust for Ornithology. And you can actually have a look at what species records exist within your area, and you can set it to like 0.5 kilometre to 10 kilometres buffer zone around the address. The only caveat is it's not supposed to be used commercially. So that, well, it's a bit complicated because there are 4 different licenses. One of the licenses isn't for commercial use, but the other ones can be. So you may have to filter out the records and then look at the ones that remain. But what an ecology consultant would normally do is request records from the local records centre, which is the local authority run, usually record centre, and a developer could do that as well, but that's a paid for service generally, whereas the NBN is a sort of snapshot. I tend to look at the NBN just to see if there's anything that I'm going to sort of trip up against, but the NBN doesn't include all records, so it doesn't include badgers, for example. You know, there are certain records that will be on there, but only within a 10-kilometre radius. So it's less useful than the local record centre stuff. But if you just wanted a quick idea, that would be where I'd recommend looking.
No worries. Well, I'm going to hit you just with 2 quick questions, folks. We are slightly running over. I do apologise, but we will be very, very quick here. Julie, if you can ask, if possible, if you can just give quick answers to these ones. D. Cameron's asking, you mentioned that one of the Wildlife Acts prevents, you mentioned when talking about the Wildlife Act that prevents causing harm. Does this not protect badgers and foxes, etc., when it comes to things? Now, this is a wee bit controversial because they have ended it when it comes to hunting and stuff like that. But if we can put it back into perspective of buildings and gardens and stuff, that would be great.
Don't forget that the Wildlife and Countryside Act primarily protects birds and named species of plants and animals, and badgers and foxes aren't named, so they're only protected under the Animal Welfare Act.
Well, and lastly, Douglas is asking, I think it's a bit of a quirky one, I don't know if he's jokingly asking this or not, but if all birds are protected, does this mean pigeons are protected?
Pigeons are one of the ones that you can get a license to remove or destroy if they're being a pest. But the answer is, while they're nesting, yes, they are protected, unless you get a license to derogate that protection. Gosh,
do you know, I didn't. I there you go, Douglas. I had no idea. I actually thought it was a little bit of a quirky question you were posing there, but there you go.
I would say I'm not a lawyer.
Just when we thought we were considering them all as flying rats. By the way, that's my opinion, not the opinion of the PCA there. So let me just stipulate that. But no, that is great. That is great. Folks, if you have had a question, we've not had the chance to pose it, I do apologise. But again, I will try and pass them across to Julie and she can get back to you then. Great. Just on the screen there, you heard Julie refer to all of this earlier on. But there is a whole host of places where if you are prepared to spend the time and you want some additional bedtime reading, there's a whole list of legislation acts you can look at. In terms of the tools as well that get mentioned earlier on, there's a link there to the magic.defra.gov.uk tool. But Julie also mentioned as well that if you are looking for tools to help give you a little bit more guidance, you can go to the GNCC website, as well as to the ones you just mentioned there, the National Biodiversity Atlas. Is that correct there? Did I say that correct there, Julie?
Say that again, sorry.
Is it the National Biodiversity Atlas?
Yeah, NBN Gateway or National Biodiversity Atlas. I'll have a quick Google and put it in the chat.
Perfect. Well, folks, that is it for effectively 2021. I just want to say a big thank you to not only everyone that joined us today, but to everyone that's joined us over the course of the year. We are back in 2022, and we do have some great topics to talk about, especially at the beginning of the year. All I would encourage is that if you have missed any of the webinars over the course of the year, the link is there. Just go to property-care.org/webinars. There's a whole library of education there for everyone to kind of jump onto. And hopefully we see many of you in 2022. But I just want to end this by saying a big thank you to everyone for listening. A big thank you to you, Julie, for the great presentation today. And hopefully everyone has a wonderful festive period and a wonderful new year. And I look forward to seeing many of you in 2022. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.